Thank you very much, Rich. Rich is always a hard act to follow, so I appreciate the kind introduction. As Rich said, I'm always been fascinated with the American Revolution. It's probably my favorite topic to talk about, and particularly any way that I can make the stories of the American Revolution local to our area. And the story that I'm going to be telling today is certainly one of those stories. Many of the men who participated in the events that we're going to discuss came from communities like the German settlement, like Frederick County, Maryland, Loudoun County, Virginia, and the surrounding areas. So our story begins on June 14th, 1775. And as any veteran of the United States Army can tell you, that date is incredibly important in American military history. Can anyone tell me why? What event is marked on that date to this day? The birth of the United States Army. And the reason why the United States Army to this day marks that date is that is the date in which the Continental Congress issues an order calling for 10 companies of riflemen, 6 from Pennsylvania and 2 each from Virginia and Maryland. These would be the first troops outside of New England to be called up to support the revolutionary cause. This is the moment when the Continental Army becomes truly continental. It is no longer simply a New England army, but an army that represents the interests of all of the colonies. That order, just read you a little snippet of it, that each company, as soon as completed, shall march and join the army near Boston, to be there employed as light infantry under the command of the chief officer in that army. So we have the birth of the United States Army out of this order. We also have another birth, and that is the birth of one of the most enduring legends in American military history, the image of the rifleman, a single individual soldier who can change the course of history through his skill and his fortitude. It's a legend that is born out of these rifle companies, but again, we will continue to see in both fiction and in history up until the modern day. So we'll talk a little bit about that, what the legacy of these riflemen are. And we'll also talk about their organization, their equipment, their dress, their experiences in 1775 and early 1776. We'll begin by talking about the organization of the companies. Now, all 4 of these companies are going to be drawn out of a very similar geographic region. The 2 Maryland companies will be recruited out of Frederick County, Maryland, which in 1775 is anything west of Prince George's County or Baltimore County, all the way out to the very far western reaches of now Garrett County, Maryland. The Virginia companies will be drawn largely from Frederick County, Virginia, the area around modern-day Winchester, and Berkeley County, which is now in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. Both of these areas are very similar in terms of their history, in terms of their population. Unlike the Tidewater parts of Maryland and Virginia, this is not an area of intense plantation agriculture, English settlers, enslaved labor. Rather, this is a melting pot of different people from different ethnic backgrounds, Germans, Scots-Irish, Quakers. You have people kind of living not necessarily on the frontier per se. This is an area that's about a generation or so removed from the frontier, but still small family farms, very little in terms of well-settled areas, cities, or anything like that. So small villages and family farms. The 2 Maryland companies will be under the command of Michael Cressup and Thomas Price. Of these 2, Cressup is the more famous. It's a name that many people in Western Maryland would be familiar with, certainly at that time. At the time he is called forth to serve as a captain of a rifle company. He's 33 years old, and he was born in a place called Old Town, which is just outside of Cumberland, Maryland. He's the son of Thomas Cressup, who's one of the most famous frontiersmen of his day. His father had been a veteran of the French and Indian Wars. He's a veteran of the French and Indian Wars. He spent time out in the Ohio country trading with Native Americans, fighting Native Americans. He really rises to prominence in the years before the Revolution as an officer in a conflict known as Dunmore's War, in which the Virginia militia goes out to the Ohio country to fight Native Americans in the area around Pittsburgh. Thomas Price, on the other hand, is a little older. He's 42 years old at this point. He was originally from Pennsylvania. He's been working as, not working, I guess, but he's a planter in Frederick County. He's got a hat business in the city of Frederick as well. Member of the Committee of Correspondence, the Committee of Observation. So he's a little more, less kind of rough and tumble frontiersman than Cressup, certainly. But he does have military experience. He had served as an officer in the French and Indian War as well. Both of these Maryland companies will muster in Frederick on June 21st, 1775. On the other side of the river, our side of the river, the two companies will be commanded by Daniel Morgan and Hugh Stevenson. Now, to anyone who's familiar with the Revolutionary War, Daniel Morgan is a household name. He's 38 years old in 1775. He had moved to Virginia as a teenager, settling in a little village known as Battletown, which should give you an indication of what Berryville, Virginia was like back in the 18th century. He certainly had a little bit to do with its reputation as Battletown. He had a reputation as a fighter and a brawler at a young age. Like his fellow officers, he's a veteran of the French and Indian War, having served on Braddock's expedition as a wagoner. Later, he's going to serve in the Virginia Provincial Forces. And the fourth and final officer that we'll talk about today is Hugh Stevenson. He's in his late 30s as well, another veteran of both the French and Indian War and Dunmore's War. He is going to come from the little settlement along the Potomac River known at the time as Mecklenburg, but today known as Shepherdstown, West Virginia. So these will be the four men who will command the four rifle companies that were called for by the Continental Congress from Maryland and Virginia. Morgan's company begins to gather in Winchester on June 22nd, and Stevenson's will begin to gather that very same day just up the river at Mecklenburg. Now, one of the problems that all four of these companies will face right off the bat is they have men. Men are eager to join this cause. They rapidly fill the ranks with volunteers. So rapidly that coming by arms is difficult. One of the things that will slow all four of these companies from being ready to march to Boston is getting enough weapons to equip all of these men. So the rifle manufacturers that are in Western Virginia and Western Maryland will be working round the clock to provide arms for these men. One of the more famous ones is going to be the Sheets Rifle Shop, owned by the Sheets family. Anyone who has ever been to Shepherdstown and seen the Chinese restaurant that is right in the middle of town, that is the former Sheets Rifle Shop, where rifles were made for Stevenson's company. With an S, not like the gas station chain. Although I'm sure there's a common relationship somewhere. Again, we're talking about very similar people. We're talking about German immigrants to the valley. So what sets these riflemen apart from other soldiers? One of the most obvious things is going to be their dress. There is no uniform for the Maryland and Virginia rifle companies. Congress doesn't ask for one. They do not have a uniform prescribed by any sort of military regulation, but they all are dressing in a remarkably similar way. To give a quote, this is a quote from someone in Frederick, Maryland, watching the Maryland rifle companies come in. Quote, "I have the happiness of seeing Captain Michael Cressup marching at the head of a formidable company of upward of 130 men from the mountains and backwoods, painted like Indians, armed with tomahawks and rifles, dressed in hunting shirts and moccasins." This description is echoed by another observer. Remarkably stout and hardy men, many exceeding 6 feet in height. They are dressed in white frocks or rifle shirts and round hats. So the hunting shirt is going to become the iconic image of the American rifleman. question is, what is a hunting shirt? This is one of the few surviving hunting shirts that we have. It's in the collection of the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. And it is a garment that early on is particular to Maryland and Virginia. It really is developed, I guess you could say, comes into fashion in the 1760s out on the frontier parts of those states. There's a lot of kind of theories as to why it comes about or where it gets its design from, but it is a distinctly regional garment in the early 1770s. There is a caped shirt, it's open down the front, it's fringed, very distinctive look. And it's a frontier garment, but as we get into this early 1770s, and particularly as we get closer and closer to the Revolution, it also becomes a political statement. Wearing a hunting shirt in Maryland or Virginia, even if you're not from the frontier, even if you live in Williamsburg or Annapolis, becomes a very, very powerful symbol of your American identity. A lot of loyalists or British authorities will start to write about shirtmen and their opposition to the crown. This is a way of showing which side of the political divide you're on. And these shirts really remain a kind of like Southern Pennsylvania, Western Maryland, Western Virginia garment until the beginning of the Revolutionary War. And as these first riflemen that we're talking about march into camps in New England, this garment is going to spread. Washington is very much in favor of the hunting shirt as a uniform. You know, the Continental Army is an army that is always struggling for uniformity. And to Washington, the hunting shirt represents a cheap option, an easy to manufacture option, something that can be layered over clothing in the wintertime to keep you warm, something that in the summertime is nice and breezy. And perhaps most importantly to Washington, it also gives the image of these men as frontiersmen. So even if you're going up against a bunch of New Hampshire militia or New York militia, Continentals from the northern states, the British may be fooled into thinking that these are crack shots from the Virginia frontier. There's a little bit of psychology working in Washington's mind at this point. I did bring in a hunting shirt that I've made. This is very similar to what you would have seen. It's a very simple linen garment. Washington's right, they don't take long to make. I made this in like a weekend and it's all hand sewn. Very practical garment that the Army will adopt. I would pass around, it's a little gross, so if anyone wants to come and see it earlier or later, yes, it's very authentic. Thank you. Okay, this one's only about 10 years old, so certainly not as bad. Several of the other things that you hear mentioned, the drawing on the left there is a period drawing, my left looking at it. That's drawn by a British officer during the Philadelphia campaign of a Virginia rifleman. You can see he's got this hunting shirt. He's got fringed trousers on. He's got a round hat. Very typical of what you would have seen. The other image, a modern image, of course, by Don Troiani, but I think really captures the essence of what these eyewitnesses are recording. You see he's in wool Indian style leggings, he's in moccasins, he's in a hunting shirt, he has a bucktail in his round hat. All of these things in the 1770s, 1780s are visual indicators of a frontiersman. And in this drawing, you can also see, barely see, he actually does have his face painted. There's several eyewitness accounts of these riflemen painting their faces like Native Americans as they go through more settled places, again, to kind of play up the image of a frontiersman. The other thing that is going to set them apart is their arms, the rifle. The 1770s are an interesting time in American arms manufacturing. The rifle is not new technology in the 1770s. Rifling of guns to make them more accurate has been around since the 1500s, but it is certainly not necessarily common. Most military arms at the time though not all are smoothbore. Most civilian hunting weapons are smoothbore. The rifle in particular is associated with Central Europeans and especially Germans. So many of the epicenters of American rifle manufacturing are places where you have a lot of Germans, places like Lancaster, Pennsylvania, places like Winchester, Virginia, Emmitsburg, Maryland. These people bring that technology with them, and it kind of spreads through the frontiers of Western America. The rifle has a lot of advantages over many military arms of the day. As I said, most soldiers are carrying smoothbore muskets. The smoothbore musket is a weapon that is designed for speed. Using a pre-measured cartridge, a soldier can fire 4 rounds a minute, 5 rounds a minute. The downside is accuracy. The British Army and most European armies, French Army, are training troops to engage at distances of no more than about 200 yards. And with a smoothbore musket, your effective range is about 150 yards or so. With a rifled gun, with the increased accuracy that rifling brings, you're looking at a distance twice that. 250 yards, 300 yards. There's one eyewitness account of a rifleman down in the Carolinas. Actually, it's from a British officer being shot at by a rifleman in the Carolinas, saying that he's over 300 yards away from the guy shooting at him, and it's a little too close for comfort. So it does have a distinct advantage in accuracy, but that advantage is going to come with downsides. As I said, the advantage of musket's speed. Tear open the cartridge, you load the powder, the ball, ram it home, you're good to go. With a rifle, you're loading your powder from a horn, you're measuring that powder out. In order to take advantage of the rifling, the ball needs to be seated very tightly within the barrel. So as you're firing, it's fouling up, becomes harder and harder to load. Most riflemen, by firsthand accounts, are firing maybe 1 shot a minute, 1 shot every 2 minutes, which puts you at a distinct disadvantage on the battlefield. The other downside is that most rifles, being custom-made weapons, they're not being mass-produced in armories, they do not fit bayonets, which again, if it's taking you close to 2 minutes to load, that's an awful lot of time for the enemy to get within close range. And so this is a lesson that the riflemen will learn the hard way during the war. So as the summer of 1775 progresses, these rifle companies begin to fill up, they begin to gather their arms, and finally, by the middle of July, they are ready to depart on their march north to join Washington's army outside of Boston. And this is going to lead to an event that has gone down in history as the Beeline March. There's a little bit of rivalry between these different companies. Certainly between the 2 Virginia companies. According to kind of legend, according to some sources, Morgan had told Stevenson that the 2 companies would depart at the same time and march together. Whatever the case, Morgan decides to leave before telling Stevenson, gets a drop on him. They start marching July 14th from Winchester towards Boston. As they're crossing the Potomac, Stevenson gets word that Morgan has left without him, and so Stevenson will depart Shepherdstown just a few days later. As Stevenson's troops march through Frederick, they're going to gather up the Maryland companies. So within just a few days of one another, all 4 of these companies are on the move north. And we have a pretty good idea of the route that they took. One of these soldiers who's in Stevenson's company, a man named Henry Bedinger, leaves an account almost day to day of where they're marching, where they're stopping, different points along the way. I got into Google Maps and plotted some of the locations he talks about from Shepherdstown up to Boston. A lot of the roads that they followed are still in use today. Once they reach Frederick, they take what is now Maryland 194 up past Walkersville and Woodsboro, right past where I grew up, on their way to Littlestown, Pennsylvania, from there to Hanover to York, and on up through northeastern Pennsylvania, across New York, Connecticut, finally to Boston. This is a journey of nearly 600 miles for these men. And this is a time in which, nothing moves faster than a horse. These are men traveling on foot. They're going to do it in a remarkably short time. As you can see, Morgan arrives first. It takes his men 23 days to cover nearly 600 miles. The Maryland companies do it in around the same time. Stevenson, all around the same time. They all arrive within a few days of one another, and they all make the journey in about the same time, which is what gives this event the name the Beeline March. These men were making a beeline and essentially racing one another to their destination. And many of the best accounts of these rifle companies comes from this march, because as they go through towns and communities that aren't used to seeing frontiersmen, it's noteworthy. People record their experiences. There's a great account of them, Stevenson's company entering Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Before they enter town, they paint their face up. As they come marching into town, they are, quote, hallooing like Indians. So you can imagine the kind of culture shock that's going on here. So when they arrive in Cambridge, the reception is incredibly warm. James Warren writes to John Adams on August 9th, 4 captains and a subaltern were killed the beginning of last week, chiefly by the Riflemen. So he's talking about they're already in action, shooting at the British in Boston. I am persuaded they will do great execution. There was but one company of them here last week. On Sunday, a very fine company came in from Virginia. Yesterday's morning, they went through this town, 3 companies more, as many are expected this morning. I never saw finer fellows. So right off the bat, they're making an impact. And for these New Englanders, there's a tremendous psychological boost to knowing that the other colonies are behind the war effort now, that there are men from Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, other colonies willing to fight and die for the cause. Another quote, these men are remarkable for their accuracy of their aim, striking a mark with great certainty at 200 yards distance. So again, they're impressing these New Englanders with their shooting ability. Washington himself is thrilled to see Virginians in the Army. These are men who have come from his state who are now taking the field. So he orders a demonstration. He orders the riflemen to come out. There's a crowd of spectators. Washington is having them fire at a 7-inch diameter pole from 200 yards. So the riflemen riddled the pole with bullets. Others fired from 250 yards, and some of the companies at a quick march, so on the move, are hitting a 7-inch target at 200 yards. This is impressive by any measure. The psychological boost that this gives cannot be understated. There's a Pennsylvania newspaper which writes a letter and sends it over to an English newspaper in London. I love this. This province has raised 1,000 riflemen, the worst of whom will put a ball into a man's head at a distance of 150 or 200 yards. Therefore, advise your officers who shall hereafter come out to America to settle their affairs in England before their departure. And this is exactly what the riflemen will do outside of Boston. The city of Boston is under siege at this point. The New England militias have gathered in the heights around the city. They've been entrenching. They've been, bringing up guns to lay siege to the city. And the riflemen are going to play a role in this by essentially harassing the British. Their favorite thing to do is to, hit an isolated sentry. Someone pops their head up a little too far above the British works. They're going to take aim at officers, as Warren mentioned in that letter to John Adams. They're picking off officers at a distance. They're harassing the British. kind of taking pot shots here and there at them, basically forcing the British to keep their heads down. This is all well and good. They're certainly having a psychological effect on the British. British officers begin removing some of the rank signifiers off their coats, lace and things like that, because they don't want to be shot by a rifleman. As impressive as this is, however, it's not going to go over too well with the rest of the army that's up there besieging Boston. One of the things that particularly irks the men of the Continental Army about these riflemen is they are exempted from any sort of fatigue duty, which means they spend all day taking pot shots at the British while everybody else in the army has to dig siege works, build entrenchments, haul guns around, haul supplies from one place to another. So these riflemen kind of get off very easy. It becomes a huge problem within the army. Discipline also begins to falter. The riflemen start to get bored with this. Drunkenness, fighting, and desertion start to cause problems. At one point, Washington has to call up 500 New Englanders to guard a drunken group of riflemen who are causing trouble, literally with bayonets fixed, having to break these men apart. One of my favorite scenes in the Museum of the American Revolution up in Philadelphia is this vignette of a brawl that occurs in Harvard Yard, where these Virginia riflemen and these New Englanders go at it. Rocks and fists flying. These men within the Continental Army are beating each other up. Artemus Ward, one of the New England generals, writes, "They don't boast so much of the riflemen as heretofore. General Washington has said he wished that they had never come. General Lee has damned them and wished them all in Boston rather than outside of Boston." Which just goes to show that kind of the sectional rivalries that we usually think of when it comes to the 19th century are certainly nothing new in the 18th century as well. Of course, this is an era where most men from Virginia have never seen a man from Massachusetts and vice versa. Very, very different backgrounds, very different cultures, and it's not always harmonious, especially when these guys don't have to do any work. So the fall and winter of 1775, things are going to change for the rifle companies. Basically, all four of the companies will go in very different directions at this point. The first to leave will be Daniel Morgan's company. Morgan leaves the camp at Cambridge in September of 1775. He and his company will be chosen to take part in the attempt to capture Quebec. This is a rather ill-fated attempt. Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan will lead a column of men across what is now the state of Maine. Unfortunately for Arnold, he assumed that Maine was about 1/3 the size that it actually is. And so, they spend weeks in the wilderness of northern Maine. Weather's against them. They get struck by a hurricane. They start freezing. They run out of food. They're literally eating the leather of their cartridge boxes and belts. And it's the winter by the time they finally reach the city of Quebec, and they reach it in absolutely no shape to take the city. An assault is made on New Year's Eve, 1775, in the middle of a howling blizzard. The image there is a kind of conjecture of what that would have looked like. Literally house to house fighting through the streets of Quebec. Morgan is captured. Most of his men are captured. While this is going on, a lot of other changes will be occurring in the other companies. Captain Cressup dies in October. He dies in New York on his way back to Maryland to recruit more men. So that's 2 rifle commanders are down. One captured by the British, one is dead. Captain Price of the other Maryland company is promoted in January. He will take command of a Continental regiment. So that's 3 of the officers down. The only remaining captain out of those 4 original captains will be Hugh Stevenson. So it's a tremendous kind of shuffling of leadership and of men. So the siege of Boston will continue until March of 1776. The holiday we usually celebrate is St. Patrick's Day. Well, up in Boston, it is also Evacuation Day. It marks the day in which the British leave Boston. But it's not the end of the story for the riflemen who are there. Almost immediately, they are marched to New York City. The thought being that, the British have left Boston. They've gone up to Nova Scotia to regroup. Where will they strike next? And Washington assumes that they will strike at New York. It's one of the largest ports on the East Coast. It's a center of trade and commerce. It's a place that has a surprisingly high loyalist population that might be willing to support the British. And so Washington bets that that is going to be their next stop. And as it turns out, Washington is absolutely correct. New York will come under the gun in the summer of 1776. Just so happens, however, that as the British are approaching New York, as they're preparing their expedition to take the city, is right around the same time that the enlistments run out for the rifle companies. They had only signed up for a 1-year enlistment. So on June 14th, 1776, they are free to go home. And many of them will do that, despite the fact that the city is under imminent threat of British attack. Many of them will come home. Now, many of the ones that do come home, at least the ones that I've tried to follow up on, will end up serving again during the war in some capacity. However, those that stay, those that re-enlist outside of New York, are combined into what becomes known as the Maryland and Virginia Rifle Regiment. The idea is, instead of having independent companies that kind of do whatever George Washington directly orders them to do, put them all into a single regiment. They take those who remain from the 4 original Maryland and Virginia companies, along with a large group of new recruits, including quite a few men from Loudoun County, go up in the summer of 76 as part of this new rifle regiment. Many of the officers from the original companies will find a place within this new regiment, including Hugh Stevenson, the last remaining guy out of the original rifle captains. He's chosen to take command of this regiment. And again, as I said, he takes command at probably the worst possible time to take command of any regiment in the Continental Army, because this is the moment when, to use a tired phrase here, the Empire strikes back. This is when the British strike their blow against New York City. One of the riflemen, a guy named Daniel McCurtain from Price's Rifle Company, who had re-enlisted, gives this great quote as the British fleet arrives off New York Harbor. He says, "I thought all of London was afloat." Talking about hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men. This is an image of British soldiers being unloaded off of this massive armada. And over the next few months, Washington will be driven from Long Island, from Manhattan, kind of battle by battle by battle, being pushed back through New York. The New York campaign is going to culminate in November of 1776 with the Battle of Fort Washington. Fort Washington is one of the last remaining Continental forts in the New York area. And among the 3,000 men who are defending this fort are the men of the Maryland and Virginia Rifle Regiments, again, including some of the veterans of the Beeline March, some of the veterans of the original companies. And if you think back to earlier when I was talking about the rifle and kind of the downside of the rifle, the fact that it's nearly useless in close quarters combat, that it takes a long time to reload, that is going to doom the defenders of Fort Washington. Because of the slow rate of fire, because of misfires, many of the men of the rifle regiments will resort to rocks. One of the German officers who's leading the assault on the fort, and this is again a modern Don Troiani image of the German soldiers, Hessian soldiers, storming the works at Fort Washington. One of the German officers wrote, "These terrible men deserve more pity than fear. They want nearly 15 minutes for loading their pieces, and during that time they feel our balls and bayonets." Now, 15 minutes is obviously an exaggeration, but it does speak to the fact that, as these guys are trying desperately to reload, these soldiers are assaulting the works. This is kind of the end of our story with the independent companies. As I said, in the summer of 1776, those that remain become part of this rifle regiment. That rifle regiment then essentially ceases to exist after Fort Washington. There are some survivors, but for many of them, they're going to spend the rest of the war on a British prison hulk in New York Harbor, if they even survive at all. It's a rather kind of ignominious end for them, but it's certainly not the end of riflemen in the American Revolution. They're going to play an extremely critical role in the remainder of the war. Now, one of the things that is going to occur during this time is it's going to force both the Americans and the British to adopt different tactics. The British have seen just how effective it is to rush against these guys as quickly as possible. And so the British are pretty tactically flexible. They're very aggressive. For the next few years or so, their default tactic when facing American riflemen is just to get in as close as you can. They might pick off a few guys, but by the time they're done reloading their pieces, you're on them. So rush in, engage at close range. The British are also going to rely on their own riflemen. They are going to have both German troops, the notorious German Jaegers, men raised from the gamekeepers and hunters of Central Europe, armed with rifles. They're also going to issue rifles to some of their light infantrymen as well. Basically, every light infantry company, rifles go to the best shot in the unit. They, however, are going to figure out the best way to use the rifle as a combined weapon. You have a company that's mostly musket armed men with a handful of rifles spread out in that company. Well, then you have all the advantages of riflemen. They can pick off officers. They can shoot artillerymen from 300 yards away. But if the enemy gets close, you've got 80% of the companies there with muskets and bayonets to drive them off. This is the exact same tactic that the Americans will adopt. It was famously at the Battle of Saratoga. Daniel Morgan is up there with a rifle battalion. He is going to work very closely with Henry Dearborn's light infantrymen to do the exact same thing. Basically, use the riflemen to pick off the British, and then when they close in, you have the light infantrymen there with muskets and bayonets to fend them off. It's a very, very powerful recipe for success. Washington, as ecstatic as he was to have these riflemen in Cambridge in 1775, really starts to cut back on the number of riflemen in the Army. A lot of the initial rifle companies that you see will get their rifles traded out for muskets. But he still is using, maybe 10, 15% of the Army will still continue to carry rifles, just for a much more specific role. These guys are skirmishers, they're snipers, they're support. You're not going to find them on the main battle line. And this is essentially the role that they will continue to carry for the rest of the war. The image there on the left, Daniel Morgan at the Battle of Saratoga in his hunting shirt. Again, instrumental to the American success in that battle, kind of this combined musket and rifle tactic. And then over there is an image painted by a French officer during the siege of Yorktown, again, kind of showing the stereotypical American troops, including a rifleman there in his hunting shirt. So, as I said at the beginning, the legacy of these rifle companies doesn't end in 1775. It doesn't end in 1781. It's going to continue on to the modern day. As I said, it's going to become a very powerful mythos within the way we look at American military history, whether it's in fiction or actual events. This idea of a single individual on the battlefield, a single person who can change the course of history through his skill as a rifleman, his toughness, his initiative, his independence. We're going to see that time and time again in American fiction. You know, the leather stocking tales of James Fenimore Cooper. Anyone who's ever read or seen Last of the Mohicans. You know, Davy Crockett. I watched that Disney movie a million times as a kid. He fits so squarely into this archetype of the frontier rifleman. And then, of course, we have real life examples of this as well. Sergeant Alvin York, probably the most celebrated American hero of the First World War. Right on up to, you know, the film American Sniper. Right on up to our 21st century military. This is an archetype that we see over and over again. It's a legacy that is born directly out of those men who participated in the Beeline March in 1775. These become the folk heroes for generations and generations of Americans. So with that, I'd be happy to try and take any questions. Yes, sir. Absolutely. The question is, explain a little bit about the use of the musket versus the use of the rifle. Well, the main difference between the two weapons is that muskets are a smoothbore weapon. There's no rifling inside the barrel. And as a result, as I said before, they're going to suffer inaccuracy. Maybe 100, 150 yards is about your effective range. I can get real deep into this kind of stuff, but that's the simple part. And the musket is the standard weapon for almost all European armies because of its ability to lay down fire rapidly, or at least rapidly in the sense of 18th century combat. As I said, if you have men who are able to fire 4, maybe 5 shots a minute, that's putting out a tremendous amount of lead, especially if you're in a line. You have, you know, groups of men all firing at once. The way it typically works in the Army is, say you have a regiment of 500 men, that's going to be broken up into companies. Certain companies will fire at certain times so that while they're reloading, other companies are firing. While they're reloading, the other companies are. So you kind of have a constant ripple of fire. It's very effective on the battlefield. I mean, it's akin to the same way in which our modern army uses automatic weapons to lay down suppressive fire. The rifle, on the other hand, is a much more accurate weapon. It is not necessarily a weapon of mass casualty or mass destruction in the 18th century. We're talking about picking off individual targets, which is why it will typically be used to shoot officers, shoot artillerymen, you know, shoot high value targets on the battlefield. And what both Washington and the British figure out is both of these types of weapon work best when used together rather than separately. You know, accuracy doesn't really matter that much if the enemy can just roll over you. So I would say that's probably that's the gist of how they would have been used in combat at that time.
Before we go on to how, first of all, Senator Boyd, second point is that since we are recording this online, you ask the question, please keep it recorded. That way everybody will see.
In waste? Yes. Rifle balls need to be patched in order to, again, kind of grip the rifling to provide that accuracy. So usually a patch of some sort of either linen or cotton, sometimes waxed or greased to make it easier to ram home. Again, one of the other reasons why it took so much longer to load a rifle. Absolutely. Yeah, just talk about the disadvantage of not having a bayonet. They certainly learned that lesson the hard way at Fort Washington. Again, if you miss with that shot, or it hits the guy next to you, it doesn't matter. There's hundreds of men rushing forward. By the time you've reloaded, that enemy can close in very closely. Both the British and their German auxiliaries are very skilled at the use of the bayonet in close combat. And if you do not have a bayonet, you are at a distinct disadvantage, both physically and psychologically. I mean, it's hard enough to stand in one place while you're being charged with bayonets. But if you look at the end of your rifle and you don't have a bayonet, what options do you have? So it's a tremendous disadvantage. Later on in the 19th century, as rifles start to be standardized by militaries, they will start to develop rifles that are mass manufactured that have bayonets. But during the Revolutionary period, that's just not the case. The British are experimenting with it, but it's not super widespread. In the summer of 1776, it is not referred to as the Beeline March, probably because, these guys are the first to come from this area to reinforce Washington. So there's a lot of kind of, I don't want to use the word mythology, but like a lot of celebration about this fact that these are Southerners who are coming up to join Washington's army. By the summer of 1776, that's happening, kind of at a steady stream. There are regiments pouring in from Maryland, from Pennsylvania, from Virginia. So it's not quite as novel by that point. There are regiments from the Carolinas. I'm not an expert on North Carolina troops. I know that in the spring of 1777, a whole brigade of North Carolina troops comes up to join Washington's army. I don't believe off the top of my head there are any with the Washington's army in 76. It's not until a little later on, but don't quote me. Sure. Ooh, that's a great question. Again, these are, about 10 pounds is usually what they weigh. They tend to actually be a little heavier than muskets because the barrels have to be thicker to accommodate the rifling. One thing that's kind of important to note, and if I go back here, the rifles that tend to be used in the 1770s are not kind of that golden age of the long rifle, these very long, delicate rifles that you will see in the 1790s, 1800s. They tend to be a little closer to the more traditional German style rifles. They tend to be shorter, stockier, and higher caliber, 50 caliber or above. But they're very heavy. I have multiple rifles and muskets, and the rifle is my least favorite thing to carry. Okay, all very excellent questions. Yes, Sheets is going to mass produce is probably a little too strong of a term for it, because again, this is kind of a cottage industry. People are making these pieces by hand, but they are going to produce a large number of weapons, certainly for Stevenson's company. They are being paid for by Continental Army, or at least theoretically, the Army is supposed to pay for them because they've been raised on the authorization of Congress. So the Congress is supposed to supply, the weapons, food, and everything else. How that actually turns out is, you know, kind of a whole different story. But as far as the ball and the powder, again, this is one of the big differences between rifles and muskets. You know, for muskets, they're all using a standardized caliber. So they're all using kind of ball wrapped in a piece of paper cartridge with a pre-measured bit of powder in it. Those are being manufactured like in places like Philadelphia by the tens of thousands for the Army. You have essentially, particularly women are actually rolling cartridges for the Army, almost every major American town. The riflemen, because they're carrying weapons of different calibers and different styles and different sizes, are largely, it's left to them to create their own ammunition. So melting lead and casting the balls themselves, which is, as you can imagine, in an army, a logistical nightmare. So again, one of the reasons why, as the war progresses, Washington's going to start switching those men over to muskets, and only really leaving rifles in the hands of the best marksmen. Yes, they do. There are roles for the companies. On this computer right in front of me, I have the roles for Stevenson's company and Morgan's company. So they do exist. So. Yes, so they volunteered when they signed up for that 1 year enlistment. They are members of the Continental Army. You know, unlike the militia, they are not bound for a term of service, you know, maybe a few weeks, a few months, whatever. They are bound to serve in the Army until the end of their enlistment. So again, you know, their enlistments run out after a year. Many of those men will re-enlist. Pretty quickly, the Continental Congress figures out that 1 year enlistments are not a great idea, that you have a tremendous amount of turnover. And so they will mostly switch to 3 year enlistments, and sometimes longer, sometimes for the duration of the war. I've seen a few hands over on this side. Yes. Yes, I mean that is certainly the idea, that you know they could use these in hand-to-hand combat. Certainly in the Carolinas, as you said, at Kings Mountain and stuff, they are going to use them. I certainly can't think of any instances like during the siege of Boston where they're going to be, you know, using them. But that is, again, part of that frontier persona that they've created for themselves. You know, there's a reason why they've chosen to dress in manners similar to Native Americans, why they're painting their faces like Native Americans, while they're carrying tomahawks. It's to promote this idea of savagery, ferocity, that you wouldn't want to get close enough to one of them to use their tomahawk. I also, you know, carrying large hunting knives and things like that. It's but I mean, it's an effective weapon in several battles of the Revolution. Certainly not what you'd want to have at a siege. Oh. I'm working on that list as we speak. There's a few that I've identified so far. Oddly enough, the ones that I've found tend to be in the Maryland companies, at least the ones from this part of the county, because, you know, Frederick is closer than Winchester, essentially, put it as simply as that. And, you know, many of the kind of cultural connections we have in Lovettsville are closer to what's going on in the Maryland side of the river than other parts of Virginia. But I am working on a list. There are not too many that I've found in these initial 4 companies. There are some. There are many more in the later companies that are raised in 1776 to form that Maryland Virginia Rifle Regiment. There's quite a few Loudoners in that regiment. And there are also, this might be getting too far off topic, but when Virginia starts to create Continental regiments, they are creating regiments that are, is it like 7 companies of muskets and 3 of riflemen. So the local Continental regiments that are coming out of here have rifle companies attached to them as well. So this part of Loudoun County, you see a lot of guys in the 5th Virginia Regiment, the 3rd Virginia Regiment in particular. That is absolutely a historically accurate thing. There's a lot of descriptions, not only of these riflemen, but of other soldiers in both the American and British armies, particularly loyalist Americans, dressing in what is kind of known at the time as Indian dress. And Indian dress means something fairly specific. You know, typically it means moccasins, it means wool leggings, and in many cases it means wearing a wool breechcloth as opposed to wearing trousers or breeches. It's very, very, very widely recorded, particularly in the Shenandoah Valley, even during peacetime. You know, visitors in the valley in western parts of Virginia talk about like going to church services and seeing men who aren't wearing pants, and like how kind of mind-blowing this is. But they're men who are out with a shirt and leggings and a breechcloth, and that's something that definitely is used. You see it in the Army as well, particularly. As I said, you know, a lot of American loyalists in Indian dress. A lot of the fighting that's done in the Carolinas, many of those men would appear in Indian dress. It's definitely a real thing, and it's a fairly commonplace thing on the frontier. Oh. Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I can actually recommend a book, probably my favorite book on the Revolutionary War, is a book called With Zeal and Bayonets Only. And it's by Matthew Spring. And it's a look at how the British tactics evolved during the war. But of course, a lot of that is done in response to what Americans are doing. So there's a fair discussion of American tactical evolutions in there as well. And as you said, you know, kind of they figure out that riflemen masked on their own aren't particularly effective. You know, sure, you can pick off people here and there, but we're not talking about causing a massive number of casualties. They're best employed shooting high value targets, hitting officers, you know, shooting artillerymen and things like that. So the answer to this becomes spread them out through the army, spread them out with men to support them. There's a reason why in today's army, not every single soldier in the United States Army is a sniper, because without automatic weapons to provide suppressing fire, without men who are armed with you know, automatic rifles, on their own, sure, they can kill people, but they're not going to cause enough casualties to necessarily, you know, drive the enemy from the field. And so what you see is, as I said, kind of mixing riflemen through the army, using them in smaller numbers, but using them for much more specific purposes, rather than massing them in the field the way you would musket-armed infantry. One of the key tactical evolutions that the British do is, you know, we have this image of the British standing shoulder to shoulder in very straight lines, and nothing could be further from the truth, particularly after 1775. They go to what is known as extended order. So we're talking about, you know, a few paces between each man. We're talking about men fighting in files. So two men, one who is firing while the other one is reloading. So, you know, you constantly got someone firing and someone reloading. And again, moving very quickly. They find, you know, even American militia, most American soldiers don't have the training with the bayonet, the training for close quarter fighting. So rushing up on the Americans and just causing them to scatter is what the British do for the first few years of the war. It's not until towards the middle of the war, once the Continental Army receives more weaponry, receives better training, particularly when Baron de Steuben comes, and others kind of revolutionize the way the army fights, that they're able to match the British in an open fight. You know, the rifle becomes an important part of this combined arms strategy, but it's not the be all end all of warfare. And it takes a little while for both sides to figure that out. I mean, certainly within the Continental Army, there are quite a few Quakers, many of whom do get kicked out. I mean, the most famous Quaker of the American Army is General Nathaniel Greene, who has, you know, reputation as one of Washington's best commanders. So it's not unheard of. Here with the local Quaker population, I know of a few folks. Rich, you could probably speak more to that than I could at this point. Oh, okay. Oh, yes, the book that I recommended is With Zeal and Bayonets Only. Matthew Spring, Spring. So the very effective, but it's important to remember that the British are doing the exact same thing. Most of the men who are leading British troops in America in the 1770s and 80s had led British troops in America in the 1750s and 60s. They had fought in the French and Indian War. They had fought using these types of tactics before. One of the big revolutions that happens in the British Army right before the American Revolution is every British regiment gets a light infantry company. These are men who are trained to fight individually, hiding behind rocks and trees and walls. They're picked from the best marksmen in the companies. Several of them, about 10% in each company, are given rifles. So they're not, this is not an alien concept to the British in the Revolutionary War. I mean, they literally write the book on it in 1771. So it's, again, hiding behind rocks and trees is an effective way to win certain fights, but it may not necessarily be the effective way to win the war. And it's only when the Americans adopt both styles of warfare, you know, both the kind of the guerrilla warfare, hiding and using cover, but also being able to mass firepower in linear warfare, the way that European armies are doing. And I would also, again, this is kind of getting further afield, but it's not even necessarily a new concept in Europe. The French are introducing light infantry companies. The Austrians are kind of the experts at this, pulling troops from the Balkans, from Croatia and so forth, as skirmishers, as guerrillas. These Hessian Jaegers that come over, this is the type of warfare that they excel in. So it's not a distinctly American thing, but, you know, it's, you know, there's a saying that, like, when, you know, every war is fought kind of using the tactics of the last war, and it takes a while to kind of figure out how it plays out on the ground. And that's what we see happening with both the Americans and the British armies. I kind of like to summarize it by saying the British Army adopts more American tactics as the war goes on, and the American Army adopts more British tactics. And by the end of the war, both armies are very adept at both styles. So, okay. I'm off the hook. All right. Thank you so much.